Okay, well, let's begin discussion of digestion in the sheep by taking a quick look at the feed and also at the skull. Now, the sheep is an herbivore, and herbivores eat forage. Forage is a major portion of their diet. Now, it might be pasture, outdoors, or in this particular case, I have a sample of hay, grass hay. This is orchard grass hay, which would be a main portion of their diet. Now, depending on their physiological state, forage may be most of their diet. However, if an animal, let's say you have a young growing animal or a lactating animal that has greater nutrient requirements, well then the diet would also include some concentrates. And I have a sample of that here. This includes corn, ground corn. It also includes soybean meal as well as some other nutrients. And so for those animals, forage would still be a major portion of the diet. But in addition, they would have some concentrates in their diet to meet their nutrient needs. Okay, now one of the things about eating forage is that forages have thick cell walls, particularly the grasses. And so for an animal to be able to digest the forage, they need to be able to grind and get the nutrients from the forage that has these thick cell walls. So let's look at the skull and see how the sheep begins to do that. Okay, so as we look at the skull, we'll look at the bottom jaw first. And as we look at this, the teeth are a little bit different than what the pig had. The animal has incisors here in the front, but it has no canines. And then as we look at the premolars and the molars, together called the cheek teeth, they're really well developed, and they also have very sharp edges. Okay? Now if we look at the upper jaw, what you see is that there are no incisors, there's also no canines, and again, you have well-developed cheek teeth. Okay, now, as we look at the jaw and just close the jaw, if you look, you can see that the upper jaw is wider than the lower jaw, and the teeth don't really meet. And so what the sheep does, as with other ruminants, is it has a very nice transverse motion, and so it's going to chew side to side, and as it does this, it's going to grind the cell wall of the grasses and begin the digestion process. Okay, the first thing we'll do as we look at dissecting the GI tract of the sheep is we'll look at it as it might be just laid out in the animal. And that's what we have right here. So here's the esophagus coming down from the mouth into the stomach, moving on into the intestines, and then finally out here to the rectum. Now, I think the thing to do is to just get a visual image. Just look at the tract and what hits you. What do you see? And when you look at the tract of a ruminant, which the sheep is an example of a ruminant, what you really notice is the stomach. And this is a major portion of the GI tract. Now, as we look at the stomach of the ruminant, it is a complex stomach, so it has more than one section. And as feed comes down the esophagus, it's going to enter the rumen, which is a large fermentation vat right here. The second section is the reticulum, shown over here. The third section of the stomach is the omasum, and the fourth section is the abomasum. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail shortly, but the abomasum is very similar to a simple stomach. Okay, as feed continues down the tract, it's going to move into the small intestine and then into the large intestine where there's additional fermentation, and then finally out to the rectum. Now the other thing you see here as you look at the tract laying here is you see that there are membranes associated with the tissue. So the membrane associated with the stomach area is referred to as the omentum, and the membrane associated with the intestines is referred to as the mesentery. One of the things that you see as you look at it, you can see it looks kind of lace-like, and what you see in these membranes is deposits of fat in adipose tissue. So this is one of the storage areas for energy in the form of fat that an animal has. That fat also cushions the organs as the animal moves around. Now if we look at the mesentery here, come down into the small intestine, you see the membrane structure here, and again you see the white, which is fat, in adipose tissue. And the other thing that you can see really clearly is you can see the vascular structure. So there's arterial supply to the small intestine here, venous drainage, also nerves within the mesentery. Okay, one other thing that we need to talk about in the small intestine is the pancreas. So as digesta leaves the stomach, it enters the first part of the small intestine here, which is the duodenum, and associated with the duodenum is the pancreas. And if you look at the pancreatic tissue, it's not very distinctive. It's sort of an amorphous tissue. As we know, it's very important to digestion because there are a lot of enzymatic secretions that it provides, as well as bicarbonate to neutralize the digesta. Okay, so digesta is going to move through the small intestine and then into the large intestine, which has several sections. The first section is the cecum, and that's, just show you here, this would be what's referred to as the blind sac of the cecum here. Then digesta continues on into the colon. This is another site of fermentation in the tract, and then it will move into the rectum and feces will be excreted. Now let's just get a measurement of the length of the tract as it might have been in the animal. Okay, so we're going to start here at the rectum, and we have about 91 centimeters here, and maybe about another 20 centimeters, so about 110 centimeters as it laid in the animal, and we're talking about a lamb that was probably a little over 100 pounds. Okay, well, what we're looking at now is the sheep GI tract, only now it's been completely dissected. So that mesentery that we looked at, that membrane that held everything together, that's been dissected off, and it's all laid out. Okay, so let's just orient again, starting up here at the esophagus, coming down to the stomach, small intestines, cecum, colon, and the rectum. So let's go back and talk a little bit about what each section does. First off, the esophagus, a tube bringing the feed from the mouth down into the stomach. Now, as we look at the ruminant stomach, it has 4 sections. So there is the rumen, basically this part here, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum. And as feed comes down the esophagus, most of it is going to enter the rumen. And the rumen is a large fermentation chamber. It's full of microorganisms, and these microorganisms are going to digest the cell wall components of the feed. So this is a very important function for the ruminant, and it's really what gives the animal the ability to use forages better than non-ruminant herbivores. Okay, so we have microbial fermentation going on here and some absorption of the end products, for example, organic acids. Okay, the second part, the reticulum also participates in the fermentation. So digesta is going to move between these 2 sections of the stomach. And then the reticulum is kind of like a gatekeeper in a sense. So it is going to control whether digesta moves further down the tract or in fact goes back to the rumen or back up the esophagus. And so what the reticulum is going to do is it can grab onto a bolus and it'll send it back up the esophagus, the process of rumination. It will be chewed again, more saliva mixed with the feed. The animal will re-swallow and it'll come back to the rumen. As the particle size gets smaller, what happens is rather than being put back up the esophagus to the mouth for more chewing, the digesta will start to move into the next section of the stomach, the omasum. So the reticulum really controls what happens to the digesta. Now the omasum, if you feel it, it really is kind of hard to feel it. And the reason it's kind of hard or firm is because digesta is getting drier. Water is being absorbed. There are a lot of layers of tissue in this section, and so that's the major function that it absorbs. Now, as the digesta leaves the omasum, it's going to come into the abomasum. And so as the digesta moves into the abomasum, there are gastric glands there, and they secrete acid, they secrete pepsinogen, and basically this begins mammalian digestion. So this is very much analogous to the simple stomach. Okay, digesta is then going to exit the abomasum to the first section of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. Now, what happens here is really significant because the pancreas secretes enzymes, it secretes bicarbonate. You have the digesta coming in from the abomasum, it's acidic. You have mixing going on, and so the pH is going to increase, and this is going to allow for the action of all the enzymes that the pancreas contributes to the digesta. Bile also enters here at the duodenum. So all the major enzymes and secretions needed for digestion enter at the duodenum. And here, if you can look at this, this is actually the pancreas. So I've just dissected it off, and you can see what it looks like. Okay, digesta is then going to move into the jejunum, and that's the major portion of the small intestine. Digestion and absorption is taking place there. Increased surface area for digestion and absorption, that's the major part of the structure of the small intestine. And then as we move down here, the last section of the small intestine is the ileum. Digestion and absorption continues there. Okay, so this is really important for the animal. Okay, now as the digesta moves into the large intestine, the first portion is the cecum. And if you look at the cecum, you can see that it's smooth. It lays flat. As we look at the colon, it's the same. Now, this is in contrast to, in some species, this is what's called sacculated. That is, you see pouches. And pouches slow down digesta and allow more time for fermentation. And so you don't see that in the ruminant. Now, that doesn't mean that fermentation isn't important here, because there is fermentation, and it does continue. It just means that the fermentation taking place up here is much more significant to overall digestion for the animal. Okay, so here in the cecum and the colon, there is fermentation again, microbial digestion, metabolism, and then eventually digesta will move into the rectum in preparation for defecation. Now, looking at the ruminant lets us look at two different types of fermentation in terms of their location. So as we talk about the fermentation that takes place in the rumen, this is what's referred to as pregastric fermentation. And the reason it's called pregastric fermentation is because it's fermentation that takes place before the gastric or acid-secreting region of the stomach. In contrast, we talk down here about post-gastric fermentation, and this is post-gastric fermentation because it takes place after the acid-secreting region of the stomach. As you look at the tract, one of the things you can see is how long the small intestine is. And so we can actually measure the length of the small intestine. I'm going to get my ruler here, and it's about 40 centimeters across the tray. And if I take that distance and multiply it times the number of loops that I have here, it turns out that the length of the small intestine is about 17 meters. Okay, so think back at the length that we started with, a little bit longer than this, and now we're talking about something that's, 17 times that. If we look down here at the large intestine and do the same thing, take our 40 centimeters and multiply through, this is about 4 meters. And so if you look at the ratio between the two, it's about a 4-to-1 ratio, small intestine to large intestine. And for the ruminant in particular, the small intestine is really important to digest all the microorganisms and products of the fermentation. Okay, well, now that we've looked at the dissected tract from the outside, it's time to look inside and get a better sense for how the digesta changes as it moves through the tract, and also look at some of the differences in the lining, particularly in the different sections of the stomach. Okay, so again, just for orientation, here's the esophagus coming into the stomach. Here's the rumen here and the reticulum here. So we're going to first look into the rumen. And the rumen is the first chamber of the stomach. And this is the major site of microbial digestion and metabolism. Okay, now as we look in here, we can see that the digesta is quite fluid. Now let's look at what the contents of the rumen looks like. The thing that I want to point out is, I'm going to use my probe here to help you see it, is that as you look in the rumen, you very clearly see feed particles. So this animal was eating grass, and you can see very clearly that there's particles of grass. Now, as we go to the next section, we're going to open up the reticulum. This section is continuous with the rumen, so it also participates in the fermentation. Okay, and so as we look at the digesta here, it's very liquid, and I'll try and scoop a little bit out. You can still see, again, grass particles here. Okay, so what's happening is the rumen and the reticulum are participating in the fermentation. A bolus of digesta moves into the reticulum. It's brought back up the esophagus in the process of rumination, and those particles will be chewed again and again, swallowed, more fermentation, until particle size gets small enough that it can pass on through to the omasum. Okay, so now let's look at the omasum. And as we look into the omasum, in contrast to those first two compartments, you can see that the digesta is very dry. And what's happening here in the omasum is water is being absorbed from the digesta, and there's many layers of tissue that are participating in the absorption. Now, the other thing that's a little bit hard to get an appreciation for, because the digesta is all in between these tissues, is that now the particle size is very small. Okay, so basically for the ruminant stomach, this is where flow is regulated. It's regulated at the reticulum. Okay, now as the digesta moves through, we'll go in and look at what it looks like here in the abomasum. And so what's happened then, in the omasum, water was reabsorbed, the digesta is very dry, and then as it enters the abomasum, you have all the gastric secretions there. So you have acid secretions, enzyme secretions, and so once again, it's very fluid. Now, the other thing that's different, if we look here in the abomasum, is that the particle size is very small. So you don't see large grass particles anymore because they're retained in the fermentation portion of the stomach and they haven't been passed on through. Okay? So now that we've looked at the digesta and seen basically the process of digestion taking place in the stomach, let's just look at the lining of the different sections of the stomach. Okay, we'll come over and look at this stomach that's cleaned out. And the first section that we want to look at is the rumen. Now, what's happening in the rumen is fermentation, microbial digestion, and metabolism, the end products of which are very important for energy metabolism in the animal. So what you see if you look at the lining of the rumen is you see all these projections, which are called papillae, and what these are absorptive surfaces. So those organic acids, ammonia, are absorbed through the papilla that line the rumen. Okay, now we said the reticulum has a role in directing the flow of the digesta. And so if we look at the lining of the reticulum, it has a very characteristic lining. It's referred to as a honeycomb. And if we look at the edges of the honeycomb, if you will, they're elevated. And what this allows is it allows the tissue to sort of grab onto the digesta, and it helps it direct the digesta either up the esophagus or send it further down the tract. Okay? And this also has papillae, so this also absorbs. Now, as we get into the omasum, remember the omasum, the digesta is very dry. And as we look at the omasum and open it up here, there are just many layers of tissues, sometimes referred to as the leaves of a book, for example. And the digesta moves in between these layers of tissue. See if I can pull a little bit apart for you so you can get a better sense for that. Okay, so these are layers of tissue here. Here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer. And it's the digesta moving through all these very thin tissue layers that basically, these two are papillae that are absorbing the water that lead to that dry digesta. Okay, and then as we move into the abomasum then, the abomasum has many folds on the inside, gastric folds. You can see them here. These are the location of the gastric glands that secrete the HCl and pepsinogen, the enzymes that begin mammalian protein digestion. Okay, so again, it was in this section where the digesta becomes very fluid again as it's continuing down the tract. Okay, and then the last thing I'll point out here on the abomasum is the outflow from the stomach is regulated by a valve called the pyloric valve. And what you see in the ruminant is the pyloric valve is present, but it is not very prominent. Okay? And what the pyloric valve does in a simple stomached animal is it really regulates outflow from the stomach. Okay? So all the digesta doesn't flow into the small intestine. Whereas in the ruminant, what we've already said is flow is regulated here at the reticulum. So what you have is less of a prominent pyloric valve and more continual outflow into the small intestine. Okay, so let's move on from the stomach and look at the changes in digesta through the rest of the tract. Okay, we've moved through the stomach, small intestine, duodenum, jejunum, and we'll come down here in the ileal section and look at the digesta. Okay, I'm just going to let it run out a little bit so you can have a look there. And what you see is the digesta here, it's green. Animal was eating grass, it's green grass, continues to move through the tract. It's taking on a little bit of a browner tinge here as we move on down the tract, but it's very, very fine. It's very well digested. There's no visible particulate as we move into this part of the small intestine. And so what's happened in between here and here is all the pancreatic enzymes and other secretions have entered the tract, and you've had digestion of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins along the tract, and a lot of absorption at the same time through the villi, which line the intestine. Okay, so let's move on into the cecum then. Now moving into the large intestine. And again, look at the digesta. And as we get to the cecum, of course, it's still very fine, but what you start to see is it's a little bit firmer. And one of the functions of the large intestine in general is to reabsorb water for the animal. And so you start to see that the digesta is beginning to firm up a little bit, even as fermentation is continuing. And then we can look here in the colon, and what you'll see is that it is even drier. And as we get down here, you can start to see the material taking on a much drier format and beginning to look like feces. Okay, so as we go through the tract, you can very clearly see, starting here with grass, and you see it being digested as it goes down the tract.